Hi everybody and welcome back to week 11. As you can see, the topic for this week is newborn care and early postnatal. It's a fairly packed session, I suppose, quite a lot of information I'm going to share. But this will also incorporate the postnatal visits that you will do with your clients, a little bit more detail about what you would cover in your postnatal visits with your client, and then we'll sort of move on to newborn care and cover things like safe infant sleep and so forth. A few things to watch as well, and a few sort of little assignments and sort of reading assignments, and a couple of things to be sort of jotting down and perhaps sharing in our Facebook group. So yeah, I hope you find this week interesting. So the first thing I thought I would just cover off quite quickly is just to give you a sort of comprehensive overview of what typically happens from the birth to when the family get discharged from the hospital. If you yourself have had a baby in Melbourne, then this might be familiar to you. But if you haven't had a baby here, or not in Melbourne or Australia, then this might be sort of new information for you. It is really helpful, I think, because a fair amount happens, and certainly the families are given some important documents that they need to really look after. So it is kind of quite helpful for you, excuse me, to know what they are likely to experience, so that you can perhaps share that with them, even in the antenatal appointments, actually. So obviously before mum and baby are discharged, both are very, I suppose, comprehensively checked and made sure that both are healthy and well. In most cases, obviously providing the baby is well, baby will be rooming in with mum throughout the stay. And in a public hospital, obviously that is a very brief stay, usually only 24 hours, maybe 48 hours following a cesarean section, and really only in a small number of cases would there be a longer stay. If the baby has not been well or had some some health concerns, then baby may be in the special care nursery, and in more serious cases the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. But obviously, mum and baby not discharged until they're well. In some, I suppose, situations, if the baby is very unwell but the mother has recovered well from the birth, she may need to be discharged and then come back into the hospital to visit baby afterwards. In the public system, again, it sort of varies from hospital to hospital, and also the availability in the postnatal unit. There are sometimes some hospitals that have private rooms. If it is a private room, then in most cases the hospital is happy for the partner to stay overnight. If it is a shared room, a ward, where there may be perhaps 2 or 3 mothers with their babies, then partners are only permitted to stay during the sort of allocated visiting hours. Before baby goes home, there are a couple of sort of routine newborn checks and tests which are done, obviously with the mother or the family's consent. The first is a hearing screening test, which is basically to obviously test babies' early hearing ability. It is, however, a screening test and not a diagnostic test, which means that it is quite a generalized test. It's not specific to that baby, and therefore there is sometimes what's known as a false positive, meaning that the baby may be tested, there may be some initial concerns or inconsistencies, and that will simply require more specific and diagnostic testing down the road a little bit. So it's something not for parents to be overly concerned about, because the hearing screening test is so broad. The other thing which is routinely offered is called the newborn screening test. Sometimes it's known as the heel prick. This particular test is done at 48 to 72 hours after birth. So if you have a client who's had a very sort of uncomplicated birth, and she and baby are well and they go home within about 24 hours, then this particular test would be done by the midwife at the home visit the next day. It is actually a really important screening test. After this slide, I'm going to get you just to pause and watch a video about the newborn screening test, which will give you a little bit more sort of deeper understanding of what it is and what it's looking for. So if people do have questions, if clients have questions for you about it, that video is a really good one to pass on to them, or for you to sort of summarize from that why it's offered. The other thing that is really important to maybe share with clients is that, as I said, they will go home with some really important paperwork they need to look after. The first is that the family will be issued with the baby's, often known as the Green Book, which you can see in the photo there. It is a developmental and sort of health record for baby. So that booklet, you would typically take to all of the well baby checks at the maternal child health nurse, for example. Immunization records and those sort of things are kept in there as well. The family will also be issued with all the paperwork that is required to register their baby with the Department of Births, Deaths and Marriages. And that's really important that they don't lose that. It is incredibly difficult to get that paperwork reissued, so they need to hang on to that. And once the baby is registered, then after that they can apply for a certificate of citizenship if that's applicable to the family. And that can take several weeks actually to get the certificate. But certainly issuing the babies and registering the baby's birth is really important in order to be able to put that baby on the family Medicare card, for example, to be able to access a wide range of health services. The Maternal Child Health app is something that you might suggest that the family download on their phone, and there's a lot of information in multiple languages as well available through the app, and there's some really handy information about newborn care, for example, and the services that the Maternal Child Health Centre can offer the family. Once they're home, as I said, there will be a midwife visit, usually within the first day or so of coming home, and that's where things like the newborn screening test would be performed, as well as just the midwife checking that mum and baby are doing well. Following on from that, they can expect 1 or 2 visits from their local maternal child health nurse, and once those home visits have been completed, then the follow-up visits will continue at the local maternal child health centre. These are council run, and usually in most council areas there are more than one maternal child health centre, and so you can share with your clients that they're welcome to attend any of the centres in their sort of local council area. And the reason for that is sometimes one centre may have staff member who speaks their language, or it may be a nurse that they just particularly like or feel comfortable with, and so it's fine for them to to look around a little bit and find a centre and care providers that they really like and that they feel comfortable with. Once you've had a chance to look at the newborn screening test video, then we'll sort of move on to talk a little bit about the purpose of the postnatal visits that you will do with your client. So pause the presentation now and head off and watch the little video about the newborn screening test.
When Charlie was born, we left the hospital as a perfectly healthy boy. We had the routine heel prick test done and didn't think anything of it. We went home and had 7 magical days with our beautiful son until walking through Coles, I got the phone call. We were asked straight away to bring him into hospital. I'd actually been screening my phone calls for a number of days, and this persistent caller kept coming through, and eventually when I answered it, your world just stops. It's a bit of a blur, really. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknown. On day 11, he was diagnosed with PKU, or phenylketonuria. In simple terms, his body can't break down protein, which means toxins build up in his blood, and if untreated and unmanaged, causes permanent brain damage. The only treatment for PKU is a strict low protein diet, which means no meat, no nuts, no eggs, no dairy, rices, pastas, legumes. Put your banana in, yeah? So it really eliminates most food groups that Charlie can safely eat. Here you go. You can get your special bread out. Take that, put that up there. That's good. She'll love your grapes, don't you? The timeliness of the newborn blood spot screening program is critical. We're very fortunate that Charlie was picked up at birth and put on this medically controlled diet, and now as a 9-year-old boy, he's thriving. He plays basketball, he plays football. He's one of the most active boys that I know. The newborn blood spot screening program in Australia is a critical program. It's what saved Charlie's life. It's bittersweet having PKU because it's a really difficult condition to manage. Take it off. That's it. But we never lose sight of the fact that it can be managed. It really does hit home what could have been. Good one, push it again. Charlie may well have had permanent brain damage by the age of 1, that's irreversible. If a parent decides to opt out of newborn screening, unfortunately that can be the consequence. So, you know, it's a simple heel prick test when that baby's tiny, and yes, they cry, but it's essential and it's what saves their lives. And if I had to do that again and again for every child, I would. To know that the program exists in Australia and all babies are screened for parents like us really means a lot.
So we're going to have a look now at the postnatal visits that you'll do with your client. And the first thing I'd like you to do actually before we go into lots of information is for you to go off and just do a little bit of an assignment and then come back. So again, if you could just pause the presentation and spend a little bit of time thinking about these things and then come back and we'll sort of carry on with discussing the postnatal visits. So the things that I'd like you to sort of be thinking about is, first of all, describe what you think the purpose of the postnatal visit or visits are. Secondly, describe how you might process the birth experience with a client, so how you might go about that. If you could sort of list the differences between what we would typically call the baby blues and more serious postnatal mood disorders or perinatal mood disorders. So a list of those two, what makes them different from one another. I'd like you to identify at least 2 situations which you believe would require referral to an external agency or a medical professional. So things that, perhaps you may experience or observe in your postnatal visits that would lead you to do that. And then finally, just to, I say discuss, but obviously jot down some thoughts, some ideas that you feel, describe the importance of closure in that doula-client relationship. Why is it important that we have a final meeting with the client, and the impact of that on your client and on you as well. So thinking about that sort of closing of the circle and why that's important. So I said, if you could just maybe pause again, go off and jot some of those things down. Doesn't need to be huge, long, paragraphs of information, just some dot points and your thoughts. And again, you might want to share that in the Facebook group. So for the next few slides, we are going to sort of break down the postnatal visits, and we're going to cover the scope, the purpose, the timings, and the goals of these meetings. We've talked quite a lot during the course about your scope of practice, scope as a doula, obviously, during, the antenatal period, during the labour and the birth. And, it's true to say we have a scope as well in the postpartum period as well, when we meet with clients after they've had their baby. Primarily, if we're talking about scope of practice as a birth doula, then your postpartum visits kind of come under your birth doula hat, if you like, and it's quite different to the role that a postpartum doula would play. So really, your role is to provide, you can see from here on the slide, an early newborn parenting support, primarily in the first couple of weeks postpartum. You would typically want to schedule your first meeting with the family, within about a week of coming home, and then perhaps another meeting a week or so later. It's really helpful if you can provide your client and her partner, if she has one, with other resources, information, support services. So that big mega list you guys have all been working on throughout the course, that's the kind of thing. I mean, not that you would hand them like a phone book full of things, but it means that you have up your sleeve a really extensive range of resources right across different areas, that if things came up in the postnatal visits, you go like, whether it's lactation issues, mental health issues, social support, in language support, etc. Things that fall very much outside your scope of practice are to provide counselling, which we covered a little bit last week, breastfeeding advice other than very general information, medical advice clearly, that relates to by either mother or baby, and also to be very mindful of imposing your personal views or beliefs around parenting. And sometimes we do this quite unconsciously, so it's a bit of an unconscious bias, I think, that most of us have, and it's just really important to always kind of just have in your head a little bit of a mantra going, it's not my baby. Not my baby is like same with not my birth, not my baby. Obviously with the exception of things that clearly are concerning you about the welfare, well-being of the baby, that's different. I'm talking about, the sort of the way that family have chosen to parent their baby, and it might look and feel very differently to what you might do or what you're familiar with, but that's not our role to impose those personal views. So that's just a very broad kind of overview, I guess, of the scope of what we are discussing as far as our postnatal visits as the birth doula. So the next topic that we're going to look at is the purpose of our visits. Very much the purpose ultimately is to close that circle, close that relationship that you have built over time with your client. For some of you, you will meet your clients really quite close to the birth. So you'll have sort of managed to squeeze in a couple of those antenatal visits. And of course, hopefully you were at the birth. And then, you have your postpartum visits. For other clients, you might actually meet them really quite early in their pregnancy journey. And so this might be the sort of the culmination of many, many months of building a really close and beautiful relationship. But it is important, to always be mindful of those professional boundaries and recognize that this relationship needs to come to a natural end. Also just wanted to, again, draw your attention to the point that the postpartum visits by you as the birth doula are different to the type of visits and the sort of the scope, again, of practice of a postpartum doula. Now, Birth for Humankind are also now offering some extended postnatal support. That may be provided by you as the birth doula, or it may be somebody else entirely. There are occasionally situations as well where you were unable to attend the birth of the client who you had been following in pregnancy for whatever reason. You at another birth, you were unwell, and so a backup doula would have attended the birth. As far as the postnatal visits go, it makes most sense for the person who attended the birth to then do the postnatal visits. But, that's something I feel you may want to then just sort of discuss with Kath and Christine, Birth of Humankind, who are the coordinators for the doula program, together with the doula who did attend the birth, and work out the best solution. It may be that if you are doing, say, two postnatal visits, that the doula who attended the birth perhaps goes to the first one, and that you would go to the second one, or that you might both attend together. So there's a few variations on how you might cover that. I think it is important, if you did obviously build a relationship with the client antenatally, even if you were unable to attend the birth, it's still important to close that circle and the relationship by meeting. And so that's something I think it's important to think about, even if you didn't ultimately attend the birth. So this slide is clearly about the timings of when these appointments ideally should take place. And I've mentioned just on a previous slide that you'll probably meet with your client twice after the birth. If you go on to work in private practice as a doula, it's entirely up to you as to how many postnatal visits you schedule. At a minimum, it really should be one. But many doulas will do two, and some will then offer an extended package of postnatal support as well. And again, that's quite different to the sort of content that would typically be covered in your first, second postnatal visits. The extended support would be more practical support in supporting the family, supporting mum at home in those early weeks and months with a newborn, helping her to really transition to motherhood. It's not the role of a nanny, and it's not the role of a babysitter. It's really about helping to build capacity and build that confidence so that new mum feels really confident and personally empowered to care for her baby and to sort of really approach motherhood, parenthood with confidence and joy, hopefully, in her parenting. So going back to the timings of your visits as a birth doula, said the first visit should probably be within the first week or so of coming home. Generally, what I tend to do is wait until after the family have had the visit from the hospital by the midwife and the maternal child health nurse, which both tend to happen in the first week of coming home. It's a lot. Plus the family, if you think about it, have also just come home. They've just made that transition from hospital to home. If it's a first baby, that has its own set of stresses and so forth. If there are other children at home, again, there's a period of kind of integration of the new baby, and it can all be a little bit chaotic. So I tend to wait until the dust settles a little bit, and so that might be sort of towards the end of the first week or so. How long should those visits be? Again, it sort of really varies. It is also up to you. It's also, in conjunction with your client and discussions with them. But I would say in general, really a minimum of an hour, but more typically an hour and a half to 2 hours would probably be a typical postnatal visit. The first meeting generally is focused on discussing and debriefing the birth, and answering any questions that your client may have. There may be periods during the labor that she doesn't have a huge amount of recall about, or things may have happened during the labor that she really needs some clarity around why they happened, or the order in which they happened, and so forth. But as a real note of caution, it's really important that you be careful that you are not interpreting the birth for her, or that you're imposing your opinion on how the birth went, because what you perceived and also even what you observed may be very different to her own internal perception of how that birth went. I can tell you for sure, I've had, a number of experiences as a doula where I've gone to a birth, and quite honestly, I've been quite horrified at how things have unfolded, and some of the things that I've heard care providers say to my client, or some of the behavior which is, really quite questionable. But as a doula, you are sometimes in a very difficult spot where you can't say anything, certainly at the time. You can only really guide your clients and support them to make decisions that they feel are right for them. And then afterwards, meeting the family at the postnatal visits, and again asking some open-ended questions about how they felt the birth went. And they say, the mothers will say things like, "Oh, that was just, that was amazing. That was just like the most wonderful day of my life and the most amazing experience. And I just want to have another baby." And you're sitting there going, "Were we at the same birth?" And likewise, it can also, be the other way around, maybe not quite as commonly, but there can be situations where, you feel things went very well, and yet your client has been left feeling really, quite upset, disappointed, even traumatized. So I would say more commonly is, particularly as you gain experience as a doula and you become, certainly more experienced about, what goes on in hospitals and what typically, you see during hospital births. It is amazing education in of itself, and certainly makes you a very sort of savvy birth observer. And your knowledge will far outweigh that of a client who's having her first baby. So we do need to be really careful about what we say, and the key is those open-ended questions where we are not sort of channeling her to say something or feel something that may not be really coming from her truly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a bit further on in this session. The second visit, which may be your second and final meeting, is really about closure. It's that closing of the circle, ensuring before you go that your client has all those resources that she needs, all that information, the phone numbers, the organizations, and clear, a clear path forward for her, so that she is feeling like she has all the tools that she needs to confidently go forward. Her and if she has a partner, that they feel as a family well equipped to carry on as a family unit. Again, depending on whether you're working as a Birth for Humankind doula, in which case that really should be your formal closure and ending of that formal ending of that relationship. As a private doula, you may choose to approach this in a different way. What I tend to do post the actual face-to-face postnatal meetings is I offer up to 6 months of extended support that over the phone, email, things crop up over time, different things happen as baby is growing and developing that are not relevant at 2 or 3 weeks after the birth, but 3 months after the birth or 5 months after the birth they suddenly have questions. And so because you have that established relationship of trust, and they know you and so they trust you, I want clients to know that they can contact me really anytime if I can be of help and assistance to forward other resources or recommend allied health practitioners and things like that. So that's something you might want to offer in private practice. Or you may go on to do some postnatal doula training as well, and then offer that as an extended package of support, or a completely separate package of support where you only do postnatal, in which we're not at the birth for the baby. But in the Birth for Humankind context, I would say it's really important that at your second visit you feel that both parties are feeling that there is this very kind of pronounced and obvious sense of closure. So that's timings. So this slide, the final one in this section here about I guess our goals, our overall goals for these postnatal visits. I'm aware that, I'm sorry, there's a lot of text on the slide, but I tried to sort of shove it lots of final thoughts on this topic in the one slide. So obviously you can pause this and just have a good read yourself, but I'll just go through it very quickly. Really, I think our overall goal is really to help families to transition to their role as parents. Obviously, it's different if the family, if the mother's already had other children and this is, not her first baby. But certainly when you are working with families who are having their first baby, it's a really, really overwhelming time. If you add to that the fact that perhaps they don't have a lot of support here in Melbourne, they may not have family, much of a sense of community. And so it can feel quite stressful and isolating as well. Some things to think about in terms of, how you may drive the conversation in your appointments with your client. First of all, asking her how she's feeling and how she's feeling about motherhood and mothering. Is it what she expected? Is it different than what she thought it would be? It's really important to acknowledge how tough it really can be, particularly in those early weeks and months. It is exhausting. It's quite relentless. It's monotonous. It can be quite isolating and lonely, particularly if she is at home on her own with the baby a lot of the time. It's important to help normalize her feelings and her emotions and know that, we want to validate what she's feeling. If she shares, things that are quite negative, it's really important that we validate those feelings and that they're not always going to be super positive. And we need to be okay with that and sort of sit with that discomfort and not necessarily do what our instinct often does, which is to want problem solve and sort of fix the problems, because, again, that's not really our job. As we've mentioned previously, we also want to review the birth and being, very mindful of the fact that we're not there to tell her birth story. If she has expressed some negative feelings, we never want to sort of minimize her experience and say things like, be thankful you had a healthy baby and, things like that, which are very not helpful. Be mindful of her physical recovery from birth and asking her about, aspects of, physically how she's recovering, how is she feeling, any concerns, how's her eating and her sleeping, and things like that. And really emphasizing the importance of self-care and making sure that she is looking after herself physically and emotionally as well. And perhaps also finding out, are there opportunities that she has where she can have a bit of a break from the baby? If she has a partner, there are opportunities when they can, be having some lovely baby bonding time together, which gives mum the time to have a little bit of time out, whether that's to have a nap, a shower, a walk, sitting in the park or a cafe, with a coffee and a book or just something. I think it's really important that we just at least plant the seed of that and make her understand that it's really important and it's not selfish to want to have some time for herself as well. Talk about the baby. And if you're comfortable and she's comfortable, to have a bit of a cuddle. This is again very personal thing. I don't assume ever that I'm gonna hold someone else's baby. If they ask, if they say, would you like to have a cuddle? then, you know, I will never say no, because I love baby cuddles, but I don't make that assumption. And I think it's really important as well, particularly in the current climate with COVID, and, you know, as I'm speaking, middle of winter, lots of very, very nasty bugs out there. You know, understandably, some families are very, very concerned about, you know, just health and wanting to protect their baby, and so forth. So, you know, things like, I think it's good practice at the moment. Again, this is very time sensitive, but I think good practice for us as doulas to be wearing masks indoors when we're visiting the family and new babies. And of course, if, you know, have any symptoms of feeling unwell, that we absolutely, you know, never visit the family. You know, babies have very fragile immune systems soon after birth, so we want to ensure that we are, you know, we're really promoting good health and hygiene practices. You know, when we're talking about the baby, you know, asking all this sort of, you know, questions around, you know, how's the feeding going? You know, how's baby sleep going? Do you have any concerns? Are there any areas that you have questions about with newborn care? You know, also maybe sort of some questions around where are their support systems, because obviously, you know, your support will soon be coming to an end. And so it's really important that, you know, you understand from them that they have started to sort of put the feelers out there. They are aware of where their community support is. If they belong to a particular faith, is their community for support from their faith-based community? You know, family, if there is extended family and friends and neighbors and things like that, as well as the professional support services as well, that they you know, she may have communicated to you that she would like some referrals and some you know, contact details of organizations or practitioners that she may want to reach out to. So look, as I said, ultimately our goal is really to help ease that transition to parenthood. And that when we leave, that we also feel confident that that family, you know, that we've left that family feeling confident and empowered to sort of parent their child. And, you know, as I said, it's not the doula's role to sort of be a nanny or to sort of in any way really take from that sort of capacity building experience. That we want to leave that new mother and partner, if she has one, both of them feeling really you know, I think confident. It's not to say that, you know, they feel like, yep, we've got this 100%, but they certainly feel they've got the internal kind of innate confidence, as well as the external tools that they need, that should something come up, they would know who to contact and where to go for support. So yeah, so that's our goals really for these visits. I thought I would take just a few minutes to go into a little bit more detail about birth debriefing and processing the birth experience, particularly because if you attended a birth with a client that, you know, was a difficult birth, particularly, then I think it's you know, important for you to feel confident about how you may approach that and discuss that with your client, particularly if you yourself were also emotionally impacted and affected by it as well. So first of all, why do we do a birth debrief? You know, what is the value in discussing it? Well, there are many reasons why it's a very valuable experience. The first is really just to help the mother to actually reconstruct the experience, and for her to sort of feel like she has a good understanding of the chronology of the birth from beginning to end. It's really important because it's an important tool to allow her to feel acknowledged and that her feelings are valid. It's a very helpful tool also to clarify or to actually correct some misunderstandings about what may have happened. It's not unusual at all during, you know, after a birth for someone to look back and to sort of have some blank spots around it, and again, that's because, when you yourself are in the middle of a labor, you're very hormonally compromised. It's a very intense physical and emotional and spiritual experience for some people, and it's easy to understand why we don't remember everything with crystal clarity. And as a result, sometimes what we find ourselves doing in the debrief is actually kind of filling in the blanks, those missing pieces, and answering questions. If she may say, oh, I remember the doctor came in at this point, and what had happened that beforehand that now she was started to talk about discussing a cesarean section, for example. Those sort of things are really important. The debrief allows her to perhaps deal with some disappointment, guilt, even anger, and in some situations, not frequently, but if the birth was sufficiently difficult, traumatic even, then it is a very normal human emotion to kind of almost want to blame somebody. And so you yourself may find that you are the target of some of those emotions. Why didn't you do something different? We discussed this beforehand, and why did that happen? So, it's, be prepared that might happen. It's very important not to take those things personally. And as I've said this a couple of times already, but it's really important that it's not our role to tell her story, particularly as we believe it happened, from our perspective. I would also just say that if you felt that there were really unresolved issues and that your client could really benefit from a more extensive and guided debriefing session, there are practitioners who specialize in this. Financially, though, if that sort of thing would not necessarily be an option available to her, then it may be possible that she could through a mental health plan perhaps seek a perinatal psychologist that she could also follow up with. So, use your own judgment around that, and whether you feel that at the end of the birth debrief, you feel that, there is a sense of closure, and acceptance and understanding, or if there are still a lot of things that still need to be processed and acknowledged that are sort of, again, really outside of your scope of practice.
Are we rolling? I'm just gonna lie him back. And the key thing is to have the arms snug at the side and to have the hips loose. So it's kind of an interesting thing about that, because in the womb, this is how babies are 24/7.
Right.
And they even sometimes tuck on their fingers. But once they're born, the arms tend to start to relax and go down.
Okay.
And they'll fight you sometimes when you wrap them up like this. But if they can get the hands up, they tend to get the hands out and they hit themselves in the face. So it's kind of confusing because it looks like that's what the baby wants.
Okay.
But babies don't get a vote. When they're not fussing, it's great for the hands to be out because that's how he's going to start learning about his hands.
Right.
It's great to put him on his stomach and let him start getting a strong neck, what we call tummy time.
Yeah.
But you don't want him on the stomach swaddled. In fact, there are a couple of things you have to pay attention to with swaddling. One is that you don't want to overheat him. You don't want blankets that unravel,
Right.
right? Because that could get over his face.
Yeah.
And you don't want him rolling onto his stomach. Those are the main don'ts about swaddling. On the back, babies feel like they're falling a little bit.
Okay.
So they tend to fuss more. I don't know if he's going to fuss or not. And sometimes just rolling a baby over to the side or stomach. Is coming. Of course, this is never for sleep.
Right.
The back is the only safe position for
Okay.
sleep. Do you use sound at all to help him sleep?
Not at night, but he likes the lullaby music, the soft music. He really responds well to that. It really calms him.
So music is wonderful, but when he was inside of you, he was hearing the sound 24. He was hearing your voice, of course, but the sound in the womb is louder than a vacuum cleaner.
Really?
And it's like, because it's the flow of the blood,
Yeah.
but they're underwater, so they only hear low pitch. You know, when you're underwater, you hear low pitch. So to be in a quiet room is actually weird for a baby.
Yeah.
And to sleep all night in a quiet room, while we love it, babies don't love it.
Okay.
And so you'll find that with the swaddling and using white noise, that's going to be even better for him.
Well, I'm often asked, what is the period of purple crying? And it's understandable that people should ask. It's an interesting phrase. And what it captures is this remarkable behavioral activity of infants in the first few weeks and months of life. And we call it the period of purple crying because it starts at about 2 weeks, gets worse for a number of weeks, and then gets better at about 3 or 4 months of age. And that's very important for parents to know. What the word purple refers to are the 6 characteristics of this crying behavior that really can be frustrating or even anger-provoking in caregivers. And let me just state what those 6 characteristics are. So the first P refers to the fact that the amount of crying that infants do, starting at about 2 weeks of life, tends to increase every week until it reaches a peak sometime around the middle or end of the 2nd month of life. So in any one day, an infant may cry a certain amount, and the next day and the next day cry more and more and more until it reaches that peak period. And for some infants, that peak will occur at 3 weeks of age. For some, it will occur at 8 weeks of age. But for all infants, they tend to increase the amount of crying they do on a daily basis and then decrease the amount of crying over the next few weeks or months of life. The U is for the fact that some of this crying comes and goes unexpectedly. By that I mean that it's not related to dirty diapers, it's not related to feeding, it's not related to anything that's going on in the environment. The baby just starts spontaneously, cries for a long period of time, and then stops, no matter what the mother or the father or the caregiver does. The R is for the fact that some of these bouts, some of these episodes of crying are resistant to soothing, and that can be incredibly frustrating. No matter what the parents do, the crying doesn't stop, the baby continues to cry, sometimes for 20, 30, 40 minutes or even a couple of hours. And that can be very frustrating, of course, as well. The second P is for the fact that when the baby cries, it looks like it's in pain. And that's understandable because the crying that infants do, the facial expression and the sounds are the same whether or not a baby is crying in pain or it's just crying spontaneously as in the period of purple crying. The L is for the fact that some of these bouts are very long-lasting. It's the longest crying bouts that infants will ever have, usually averaging on about 35 minutes or 40 minutes per bout, and that's longer than ever occurs again. Some of them, of course, are as much as 2 to 3 hours, which is even more frustrating. And the E refers to the fact to remind parents that this tends to occur in the late afternoon and evening hours. Even though it can happen at any time of day or night, it's more likely to happen in the late afternoon and evening. And this can be frustrating because parents who've been with the baby all day are tired, parents who are coming home from work are tired, and they have the feeling that the baby's just doing this to get at them. But it's not true. They just tend to do it in the late afternoon and evening hours. And another question I'm asked is whether or not this period of purple crying is the same or different than colic. And that's a very good question because, of course, the word colic has been around for a long time. The word colic is used by pediatricians, it's used by mothers and fathers of babies to describe a very high crying infant. And for those people who have had a baby like this, they'll recognize all of the characteristics that I just described when I described the period of purple crying. But what's different about colic is that it's usually considered to be a condition or an abnormality that some babies have and that other babies don't. And that's not the case for the period of purple crying. What we are describing here is the pattern of crying and the characteristics of crying that all infants have. It's certainly true that some have much more of it and some have much less of it, but they all have this tendency to increase the amount of crying they do in the first couple of months and then decrease it afterwards. They all have the tendency to have unexpected crying, to have crying that is resistant to soothing, that has a pain-like face and long episodes and clusters in the evening. And while that is also true of infants who have traditionally been called colicky, it's true of all infants, and that's why it's important for all parents and all caregivers to know about it. So that also brings up another important question, which is, how do you know that your baby's not sick if it has these characteristics of crying? And that's an important question as well, because any baby who is sick certainly is likely to cry more. But of course, what we're talking about here is a pattern of crying that goes over days, weeks, and months in the first months of life of a baby. If a baby is sick and cries, that's likely to be more acute. It's likely to be associated with some other things like diarrhea and vomiting, or a fever, or weight loss, or not feeding, and other kinds of behaviors like that. But because it may be due to a disease, it's very important that early on in the crying that your infant does, that you do see your physician or your healthcare provider so that he or she can do a number of tests to make sure that this crying is not due to some other disease or some other condition. And the vast majority of time, over 98% of the time, it won't be. But it is important to have your baby checked by your healthcare provider. When that's done and when they do their tests, and if the crying continues to go on, it will not be a surprise because this, as we said before, this period of purple crying is something that all infants do. They do it more or less. It's part of normal behavioral development, even though it's incredibly frustrating to parents and caregivers. The other thing that's very helpful to know about the period of purple crying, and this is the reason we use the word period, is that the long-term outcome is actually very, very good for infants that go through this period of purple crying. There is no increased risk of negative outcomes later on, of having a disease later on, of having allergies later on, or anything like that. The period of purple crying is part of normal behavioral development, and the word period attempts to capture that. It starts at about 2 weeks of age. As we said, it peaks at the 2nd month of age or sometimes into the 3rd month of age, and then it tends to decrease by the 3rd or 4th month of age. And therefore, it's something that does come to an end, however frustrating it may be when it's happening with the caregivers or with the parents of the infant. The one negative consequence that can come from this crying, however, is if the caregiver, whether that's the parent, a temporary caregiver, or an in-law, gets so frustrated and so angry that they lose control and do something negative with the baby. The one we talk about most often is shaking the baby. This is what's called shaken baby syndrome. And if parents take the baby and when the baby's crying and they hold it in front of them and they shake the infant back and forth, and the infant can suffer what we call shaken baby syndrome. And this is a very, very severe form of abuse. It's very dangerous for the baby. The baby can have significant brain damage, it can have blindness, and it can have cerebral palsy and all kinds of other negative consequences that are not good for the infant. And this can be prevented by just understanding that this early infant crying pattern is not something that's directed against the parent. It's not because the baby's a bad baby. It's not because the caregivers are doing something wrong. It's because it's a normal part of infant development. It's very frustrating, of course, if you're the only one with the infant and taking care of the infant, but it is important not to lose control, not to be frustrated by it, and not to get angry, and never, of course, shake the infant. Much better to put the infant down in a quiet place, walk away, gain control of yourself, and then come back and check on the infant in 5 or 10 minutes after you feel better. It's also important for parents who are going to leave their baby with a temporary caregiver that that temporary caregiver understand the period of purple crying too, because that inconsolable crying bout may come when that temporary caregiver is there, and they need to know not to shake the infant, that it's okay, that it's not their fault, that they can call you and let you know that the baby's crying so that you can come back home and help them with it, but not to lose their temper and not to lose their control.